I am Linda van Tilburg for National Security News. South Africa is entering a new phase with the government of national unity, where the ANC, who has been in power for 30 years, has entered a power-sharing agreement with opposition parties. Well, this significant political shift raises questions about its impact on the country's foreign policy. And who better to discuss this with me is Professor Gilbert Khadiagala. He's a professor emeritus at the University of the Witwatersrand, and he has taught at various universities in the United States. Well, can we start with sort of a broad question? What can we expect? Can we expect changes in South Africa's foreign policy under this new government of national unity?
Anytime there is a change in government, even ministers in South Africa, because the pattern has been there has not been any real change in administrations until this year, when the elections produced a coalition government. So for the first time, South Africa is having government of national unity, which encompasses all the parties, most of the parties that participated in the elections. So it is going to mark a significant change because coalition politics is very difficult to handle, particularly for parties that have been working together in parliament, but not in a really cordial manner. The ANC and the Democratic Alliance have always been at odds with each other on many issues. So the coalition, the GNU has two dominant partners, the ANC and DA, parties that never really work together very well. So this gives them an opportunity really to begin to rechart South Africa's domestic and foreign policies in directions of compromises and give and take. Coalition governments are marriages. They only work when the parties work at it. And the goal is to succeed because the next elections are coming up in 5 years. So they need to work very quickly to create a synergy, to create a chemistry of working together so that on the domestic front and on the foreign policy front, they can produce results that strengthen South Africa's domestic environment, which has been in fact marked by really reversal of big changes in the system, where the economy is not doing as well, unemployment is still very high, inequalities are still high, and infrastructure has been collapsing over the last few years. So there is general discontent within the country about the direction of the country. And that's why the ANC didn't do as well as it has done in previous elections. So I think that is a wake-up call for the coalition partners to want to begin to reverse this decline that has been very gradual. So I can see that there's going to be real changes within South Africa because this is the first time these parties have worked together, at least in the post-apartheid South Africa.
Well, can we look at the international's portfolio, which is what South Africa call its foreign minister? It was previously held by Naledi Pandor, with now it's Ronald Lamola, her successor. And will he have a different approach, do you think? Because when it came to the case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, he was also part of that court cases in South Africa's team. So do you expect anything different from him?
There will be a change of tone, there will be a change of style, because Mr. Lamola was justice minister and therefore he spearheaded the case at the ICJ against Israel. But I think the person who was really the key actor in that drama was the minister, the former foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, who you remember was accused of making a phone call to Hamas leadership just after the after the attack in Israel in October last year. And she's been very much upfront on the Palestinian question within the larger South African foreign policy establishment. So the change is going to be that even though Minister Lamola spearheaded the case at the ICJ, but I don't really see him paying too much attention to that case. And for a simple reason, that case, South Africa made its case at the ICJ, but I think there is a perception that there is really no point in escalating the conflict between South Africa and Israel over the Gaza problem. I think the case has been made, and it's in the hands of the ICJ. I do not see South Africa taking a much more radical line under Lamola on the ICJ, because, as I said, I think Minister Naledi had almost a really emotional and personalized interest in the case. And I think it was her style of leadership, her style of perception of the world, had her commitment to the Gaza issue. So I think there's going to be a slight stepping back from that kind of too visible position on the Israeli Palestinian question. So I think it's important that he is there as a new face, and I think we'll see some changes on that front.
Do you think he might also get a better reception in the United States that you know really well? Because when she visited recently, she didn't get to see any senior political officials sort of at the end of her tenure. Do you think he might get a better reception?
I think he'll get a better reception because just recently President Biden called President Ramaphosa and congratulated him for the government of national unity and wishing him well. So I think there is a broader warmth, I think, emerging around the GNU that is going to make a difference in South Africa-U.S. relations. So when the minister, I think, goes to the U.S., I think he'll be well received. He's a new face, as I said. It's very different from somebody who's been in the same ministry for 5-6 years. So I think just and he's young, and I think he will make a big difference to U.S. officials.
So apart from possibly stepping back from this court case, do you think that there would be a change in South Africa's stance on the Middle East conflict in general?
No, I don't think so. I think that will be one of the areas that we will define as areas of continuity in the larger part, because even though the DA has been had a clearly pro-Israel position, and the ANC, of course, has a position that favored Iran and the Gaza, of course. But as I said, when they begin to negotiate about foreign policy, they will have to get a middle ground. And the middle ground is simply going to be that there are some issues we should not be overexposed ourselves. For instance, on issues such as Yemen and so on, or even Iran, I think there will be recognition that it doesn't really help to jeopardize relations with Western countries on issues such as Iran, because even though the ANC has actually been very good ally of Iran, but so those kinds of baggage, I think, will take a lesser prominence in South African foreign policy. But as I said, on issues like Gaza, there is a position that has been made clear under the previous administration that they support Gaza. That has been, they support the Palestinians, that has been a very consistent line. So I don't see South Africans actually departing from that. or pulling back from that position. But as I said, they will at least try to tone down that kind of anti-Israeli postures that the last administration took.
Well, can we go to another issue, which is BRICS, which is Russia, China? What do you expect there? Can we expect any more naval exercises in the coast of South Africa with Russia and China?
Again, I think if there is more movement towards a rapprochement with the United States, because Congress has been very hard on that issue, that South Africa's security interests are actually hurting the U.S. security interests. So, I mean, that under AGOA, for instance, countries are not supposed to take positions that endanger U.S. national security. Again, I see a pullback from that position of more close alliances with China and Russia militarily. This is not going to be soon, but I think it will gradually become part of a genuine administration, that there is no reason why South Africa cannot go back to the previous non-aligned position, which said we can be friends with all these, we can be friends with the East and West, but without military engagements with these powers that actually tend to be against the interests of the United States and the West. So I think that is going to be one of the issues that comes out very clearly. Maybe next year, by end of next year, on the China-Russia military collaboration, I think that will go down.
And what about South Africa's position, if we can look at Africa? What about the involvement of South Africa in the DRC, which has, the DA has been very critical about that?
The DA is critical of that because when they make the position that South Africa needs to be more inward-looking in expending its resources on domestic priorities, not engaging with conflicts in Africa that it doesn't really understand sufficiently. So I suspect that the South African engagement under the SADC mission in the DRC will actually come very much on the front burner of foreign policy, because South Africa will have to decide whether it's making a difference on the ground through this military intervention, or whether South Africa should begin, in fact, to push for a negotiated settlement towards that conflict. Because this year, when President Ramaphosa went to Rwanda, because Rwanda is a key player in the Eastern DRC, the Rwandese seemed to suggest that South Africa was moving towards a political solution to that problem. That hasn't happened yet. But I think there is a sense within South Africa that a military engagement is actually not as productive as the administration was posing at the beginning. But you also remember that South Africa is not doing very well on the ground in the Eastern DRC. It has lost a few soldiers, and there are reports there that the troops are actually not even prepared to fight the M23. So that kind of posture, or what is coming out as the unpreparedness of the South African military within the SADC mission, is going to force a rethink of the military component of that intervention. And my point has always been also that it's important that South Africa should use its position within SADC to put more pressure on the Congolese government under Mr. Felix Tshisekedi to actually try to find a political solution to that problem, because it's not going to go away. And there are no military solutions to that problem.
And
that's the
one I wanted to.
Where South Africa was also engaged. The SADC military force there, again with a heavy South African contingent, is beginning to withdraw from that conflict in Cabo Delgado. However, the Mozambicans are now rethinking the pullback of SADC, even though they have not made it official that the rebels are getting stronger in the context of the pullback of SADC. So I don't know how the South Africans are going to renegotiate the engagement in Cabo Delgado, because they are moving out, but the rebels are getting stronger, and there doesn't seem to be any real political will for a South African re-engagement under what is called a SADC mission in Mozambique.
Sure. Okay, if we look at South Africa's role in all these bodies, in BRICS, President Ramaphosa is going to be the president of the G20 next year. What kind of role do you foresee for South Africa in the future now with this new government and with the new dynamics in South Africa? Could it play a bigger role in Africa?
I think South Africa would still want to play a bigger role in Africa, with the caveat that because of the declining resources, I don't think it's going to put a lot of money on the African engagement. I think it's going to be engaged as vigorously as it did previously in the African Union. In fact, in the debates about the AU's representation at the G20, maybe it's going to work more closely with the African delegation at the G20 this year, so that they can forge common African positions, because it's now a good opportunity for the African Union to learn from South Africa engagement in the G20, and probably to work together towards some common position. So I think the leadership there is important, because the African Union is going to the G20 really not clearly sure what it's going to do there, but they would need the hand-holding by the South Africans. So that's a big role. And then, of course, next year, the G20 is in South Africa. So South Africa is going to have to use that position more creatively to showcase not just the renaissance at home, but also its growing international role as a party, as a country that is confident of itself, but also working collaboratively with other partners at home to deal with the very real problems of domestic politics.
So would it be correct to summarize what you said about South Africa's involvement to say that there seems to be a pulling back of the more contentious parts or areas of international relations, and South Africa would really more go towards a real non-aligned country than it was in the past, say, 5 years?
Yeah, I think the return to the original non-alignment, I think, is what I predict as the cause that would be acceptable within the larger GNU. Because there are parties there who are contesting South Africa's leadership on issues that are not as pertinent domestic development. And therefore, I think it will have to step back from some of those positions, like military engagements with the Russians and the Chinese, in order to avoid the kinds of problems it has faced with the United States over issues like AGOA, and all that. The links with the West is not something that should be taken for granted. And I think the GNU is going to push for that position, because you have trade. Trade is going to be important in foreign policy. And the trade issues are very much international relations issues. So the minister will have to negotiate with the DM minister on trade to reach some compromises that I think are inevitable within the context of our GNU.
And what about BRICS? We haven't discussed BRICS. I've mentioned that the joint naval exercises, but what do you see? Will South Africa support some of the more radical policies like, well, I say radical, but de-dollarization?
My thinking is that it's going to remain an active member of BRICS. I think largely because of its really broad relations, especially economic and trade with the Chinese. So it won't want to risk those relationships. And BRICS now becomes a place where I think South Africa and other players, in fact, can work together around strengthening their ties. They call it the South-South, but it's not really the South-South because countries like Russia and China actually do not belong to the South. But it's a coalition of countries that really want to have more economic relations. But as regards to issues of de-dollarization, I also see see South African foreign policy moving away from that kind of position, because I don't think it's going to be helpful if you are pushing more close relations, especially on trade with the U.S., to talk about de-dollarization. So it's a kind of agenda that is probably going to disappear in South African foreign policy, even though it remains very much part of BRICS. But the other component of BRICS is that there are other new members coming up on board. Putin has suggested that probably an additional 10 members, and already the BRICS is growing. So South Africa's influence is essentially being watered down a little bit. The more members you have, the less visible South Africa will be in BRICS. And that's why it will be easy to drop a crusade such as de-dollarization and not really lose face.